The last European Parliament plenary to discuss this desperate humanitarian crisis took place in April. Since then, the situation has continued to deteriorate dramatically. So far, more than 41,000 people have been killed, and a further 95,000 have been injured in Gaza. Almost 2 million people are internally displaced. 495,000 are facing catastrophic levels of food insecurity, while 745,000 face emergency levels of food insecurity. And 86% of Gaza Strip remains under Israeli evacuation orders. I could go on with these harrowing statistics. It is nearly a year now since the brutal and indiscriminate Hamas terrorist attack against Israel and the beginning of the war in Gaza. For many months, we have remained steadfast in our call to reach an immediate ceasefire, unconditional release of all hostages, and protection of civilians. Today, this call is more urgent than ever. In Gaza, the collapse of the sanitation, waste management, and health systems, coupled with summer heat and overcrowded conditions in the camps, has led to severe and widespread disease outbreaks, including hepatitis A, polio, and skin and respiratory infections, affecting children in particular. Violence and obstruction continue to impede humanitarian workers' efforts to support those in need. Despite extremely dangerous conditions and severely constrained humanitarian access both into and within Gaza, our humanitarian partners are working around the clock alongside local Palestinian organizations, risking their lives, trying to deliver critical support to Palestinians in need. Sadly, and absolutely unacceptable, the Gaza Strip has seen a globally unprecedented death toll among UN personnel and other aid workers since October. Humanitarian access must be granted according to international humanitarian law and must not be used as a political tool. Israel has a legal responsibility to ensure humanitarian organizations have safe access to those in need, as recalled by the International Court of Justice in its advisory opinion and in line with several UN Security Council resolutions. We therefore reiterate our call to all parties to abide by international law and in particular international humanitarian law. The United Nations, and in particular UNRWA, are irreplaceable when it comes to the humanitarian response in Gaza. Their mandate must be respected, and we will continue to support them. On a rare positive note, I'm glad that the World Health Organization, with its anti-polio vaccination campaign, has exceeded its target. The first round of campaign has now concluded across Gaza successfully, and the round 2 for administering the second dose of vaccine is set to begin in 4 weeks' time. It is significant that the parties have understood the crucial necessity of this campaign, and this anti-polio vaccination campaign is a good example of how political will, when it is there, can enable such operations, and the proof that a constructive dialogue is possible. Since we last discussed this tragedy back in April, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, has also seen a surge in violence. Demolitions, construction of illegal settlements, and forced displacement of resident Palestinians and refugees All of this is on the rise, as are terrorist attacks against Israelis. There have been over 600 Palestinians killed, including more than 100 children this year alone in the West Bank. The EU has already imposed sanctions on some of the leaders of the extremist settlers and relevant entities. Furthermore, discussions are currently ongoing in the Council following High Representative Borrell's proposal to impose sanctions against violent settler enablers, including 2 ministers, for their public incitement to violence against Palestinian civilians. While we strive to solve the immediate problems, we must also continue our outreach in favor of the two-state solution. Next week, during the UN General Assembly High-Level Week, High Representative Borrell, alongside the Arab League OIC Conference Contact Group and Norway, will co-host a high-level meeting to revive the political process. A process that includes all stakeholders and aims for a peaceful and secure coexistence of 2 states, Israel and Palestine. As part of our efforts in favor of the two-state solution, we need to continue to support the Palestinian Authority, including through its reform process. The European Union is the biggest provider of external assistance to the Palestinian Authority. In a sign of our commitment, the Commission has adopted an emergency package of 400 million euros for 2024, of which over 270 million euros have already been disbursed. We strongly believe that the return of the Palestinian Authority to govern Gaza is the only viable solution. Finally, the risk of regional escalation from Iran or its affiliated groups in the region further highlights the importance of reaching a ceasefire and the release of hostages in Gaza, and the importance of working on the resumption of political process. The European Union is ready to work with all relevant actors towards this goal. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kommissar. Es sprechen nun die
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Now we have the representatives from the political groups. We begin with the EPP and Mr. Scherber.
Szanowna Pani Przewodnicząca, Panie Komisarzu.
President, Commissioner, the barbaric attack by Hamas against Israel on the 7th October of last year destroyed peace in the Middle East, something that we had worked so hard for so many years. Human lives were destroyed, and this is why I'm calling for the liberation of the hostages that are being held hostage by the Hamas terrorists. We have a Holocaust historian in Poland was assassinated tonight, and the Israeli government wants the safe return of these hostages, and the European Union should support peace. But Israel has the right to defend itself according to international law. However, civilians should be looked after, including women, children, and humanitarian aid must be given in a sufficient way. The European Union has the appropriate instruments to cooperate with the United States and other countries, as well as with other organizations, in such a way as to achieve peace and to pressure for peace. But when we speak of the Middle East, we need to point out that there's a growing risk on the part of Hezbollah, which receives support from Iran. we'll soon be coming up to the first anniversary of the Hamas attack. Let's remember the victims and the hostages which are still being held by Hamas.
Spricht jetzt der Kollege Maniatis.
Thank you very much. For the S&D, now Mr. Maniatis.
Αγαπητοί συνάδελφοι, οι ειδήσεις που λαμβάνουν.
Dear colleagues, the news we receive from Gaza every day is dramatic, and nearly a year after the horrendous terrorist attacks of Hamas against Israel, the appeal for a ceasefire and the immediate return of all hostages home are a sine qua non for us to put a stop to this incredible humanitarian disaster. Civilians in Gaza are the victims both of Hamas and of the policies of the Netanyahu government, which will not hesitate to bomb schools, camps, and UN facilities, and will not allow for the necessary supplies to go through. It is self-evident that Israel has the right to defend itself, but any military attacks cannot be disproportionately harsh against civilians and have to be in compliance with the international court and international humanitarian law. There is no way you can accept this, you cannot disallow medicine and food to go in because Palestinians in their thousands are ill and hungry. UNRWA has a very important role to play in order to cover the basic needs of Gaza residents, and we should continue to financially support this part of the UN, which is active under very difficult circumstances. And let us not forget that as the war goes on, the threat of this crisis escalating in the bigger region of the Middle East grows higher. So we need an immediate ceasefire. Europe should be at the forefront for an international conference which will try to restart the negotiations for a viable peace agreement. The recent visit of the High Representative to the area and also the meeting organized last weekend by the Spanish government are steps in this direction, and they should be successful. We, the Socialist Group, are convinced that the only sustainable solution is that of the two states, an independent Israel, which will be safe, and an independent, democratic, and sustainable Palestinian state within the 1967 borders. We cannot allow extremists to make use of this war and put aside any opportunity for peace. And we see the Netanyahu government, and we see that extremism is not a solution. Our priority should be to move everyone towards a ceasefire, first of all to an agreement, and then to a return of all hostages. Thank you.
Dankeschön. Für die PFE-Fraktion spricht jetzt der Kollege.
Thank you. Next for the PFE, Mr. Stettler.
Dank u wel, mevrouw de voorzitter.
Thank you, Madam President. On the 7th of October 2023, terrorists from the Gaza Strip entered Israel. 155 Israelis were abducted. 12,000 people were brutally murdered, including many children. Why did Hamas think that they could beat Israel? Did they think they would win the war? Of course, the goal was to hit Israel in the heart and to incite the international community against Israel. The terrorists knew that the hostages couldn't be recovered. All eyes on Gaza was their goal, and they've achieved that. Israel is under pressure, but actually it's a question of Iran, a terror organization supported by Iran. They get international assistance. Their leaders are becoming rich, and they are setting up military infrastructure in Gaza with international support. This is a misappropriation of money. There are The families of terrorists are supported by further funds. But the Commission answers questions saying that the money is paid to the PLO and not to the Martyr Fund. We're supporting, they said that there's stopping funds, but actually increasing them, even though the PLO is involved in the Martyr Fund and are rewarding the terrorists of the 7th of October. No wonder that 2/3 of the Palestinians stand behind the terrorist deeds. Israel has the right to defend itself against this aggression. Of course, every loss of human life is terrible, but Israel didn't start and must retrieve the hostages. The war can be ended today. A ceasefire can be achieved today if Hamas releases the 100 remaining hostages. That should be our aim. If the Commission were to start with that, then after that we can talk about peace. Bring them home.
Für die EKR-Fraktion spricht jetzt die Kollegin Kanko.
Next is Mrs. Kanko for the ECR.
Thank you, Madam President. Commissioner, Hamas is a terrorist organization. This is not something that I'm saying. This is something that we all know. It is reality. A reality studied and legally confirmed by the European Union, who clearly recognizes Hamas as it is. A dangerous Islamic terrorist organization. Dangerous to whom? To all of us. A threat to our security. This is why an organization is put on the list of terrorist organizations in the first place. So, dear colleagues, my question to you today is simple. How are we, the representatives of this Parliament, supposed to feel safe when a member of this House, elected to represent our country's citizens and freedom, goes to a demonstration in a foreign country, namely Jordan, and stands enthusiastically among protests who have slogans supporting Hamas, the terrorist organization that is recognized by us as such and that demonstrated its level of cruelty and bloodthirst? According to the French newspaper Le Point, this member was left-wing MEP Rima Hassan. She participated to a pro-Hamas demonstration in Jordan, where participants honored Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh with slogans glorifying jihad and threatening to remove Jews from Jerusalem. Rima Hassan enthusiastically attended the demonstration and published the videos on her social media. Again, Hamas is recognized by the EU as an Islamic terrorist organization and has killed, kidnapped, and raped innocent people on October 7. And long before, as we all know, it is a terrorist organization that means hell for Palestinians and Israelis and represents a serious danger to Europe, hence its presence on the EU list of terrorist organizations. So on the one hand, we have the hostages and the innocent victims. On the other hand, we have the Hamas terrorists and their friends from Iran and Hezbollah. On whose side do we want to stand as European Parliament? I may hope that all of us will stand on the side of the hostages, of the innocent, of our own citizens and society, on the side of freedom and security, on the side of Europe. Thank you.
Dankeschön. Für die Renew-Fraktion spricht jetzt die Kollegin Woutmans.
Thank you for Renew, Mrs. Woutmans.
Dank u wel, mevrouw de voorzitter, collega's.
Thank you, President. Colleagues, the numbers are clear. Since 7th October 2024, we've had 40,000 dead in Gaza. 1/3 were children, babies. This is horrendous. But, dear colleagues, what I find also horrendous is that the majority of this assembly today refuses to call for an end to violence, a ceasefire. This is what we need. We need a ceasefire immediately, a permanent one. This is necessary in order to de-escalate the violence in the entire region. And we can see that a majority of the UN member states on the 12th of December 2023 called for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, and this message was repeated in several UN resolutions. Even more importantly, on the 19th of February, the European Council put out a public statement with the same message. And now it's been nearly a year, colleagues, and I'm looking at all of you in the eye. Our Assembly has also called, after a very emotional debate, for a ceasefire and negotiations. So let's put an end to all of this senselessness. Let's call for a permanent ceasefire and for the liberation of all the hostages. Thank you, because this is what needs to happen today. Thank you.
Dankeschön für die Fraktion der Grünen.
Thank you very much. For the Greens Group, Mr. Soondale.
Tak for det.
Thank you. More than 41,000 people have been killed in Gaza. Many people are hidden underground, under ruins. Women, children, civilians killed by bombs raining down on the population which can't flee. Hunger, thirst, no medicines, assistance that isn't brought in. It's a real humanitarian catastrophe, and it's a multi-year health crisis. Bombs on hospitals and journalists, doctors, and others have been killed. Torture is widespread. Children are being abused in Israeli prisons. The hostages are still in Hamas tunnels. And all the terrible terror, the anger of the terror attacks is widespread in Israel. The number of displaced Palestinians has increased manyfold, and there are also the killings carried out by extreme settlers in the West Bank. The right-wing Israeli government supports the illegalities. The whole area has become an area of high tension. We must stick to international law and the goal of peace between two peoples, and ceasefire now and release of the hostages. Hamas and the Israeli government shouldn't let civilians pay the price. We should respect international law and agreements. It is our responsibility to help to achieve peace. It won't be achieved by more violence. We're not talking about self-defense. It's a question of collective punishment. Both sides don't see each other as people. But the one side is an occupier and the others are the occupied. We should stick to the international legal order, the two-state solution, and our words should be followed up by actions.
Please, colleagues, watch your speaking time. Es spricht jetzt für die.
The next speaker, for the left group, Ms. Boylan.
Prior to the 7th of October, 2023 was one of the most violent years for Palestinians in over a decade. Israeli soldiers had murdered 247 Palestinians, 47 of which were children. But there was no EU outcry. In fact, for over 16 years, the Israeli authorities have violently imposed an illegal blockade on the people of Gaza, something the EU was aware of but took no action. The war in Gaza did not start on the 7th of October. Israel has repeatedly trounced international law and committed war crimes without any consequence for years. And if the EU really believed in the rule of law and human rights, the EU-Israel Association Agreement would have been scrapped long ago and sanctions would have been swift and harsh. But unfortunately, EU double standards is the norm when it comes to Israel. However, the acts of barbarism that we are witnessing in Gaza right now are beyond our comprehension. A genocide has been live-streamed into our homes, and not a single person in this chamber or any of the EU institutions can say that they didn't know, that they were not aware. A 649-page document really documents the names and ages of those recently slaughtered by Israeli forces. The first 14 pages are the names of those under 1 year of age. Babies. 14 pages of dead babies. So the question for the EU today is, does it recognise the International Criminal Court? Does it recognise the International Court of Justice? Will it abide by its decisions? And if so, then it is time for Israel to finally be held to account.
Thank you.
The next speaker for the ESN group is Mr. Stoyanov.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The situation in Gaza is becoming a genocide. The civilian victims are almost 41,000. More than half of them are women and children. According to the United Nations, every day around 130 people die. Then there are civilians. The European Union is built on the foundations of peace. The slaughter, the bloodshed is disastrous. However, the institutions seem to be indifferent. We in our group condemn all forms of violence. The reaction after the beginning of the war in Ukraine was swift. However, this doesn't seem to be the case in the war in Israel. What we ask for is a consistent approach for all military conflicts. And most of all, we call for peace. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. Mandel.
Thank you very much, President, Commissioner, colleagues. It's good that we keep the attention up for the situation in the Middle East. And I just want to clarify time and again what's really ongoing. The Iranian mullah regime has been attacking via its proxies Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Revolutionary Guards and others, many parts of the world, especially the State of Israel, a democratic rule of law-based state, a partner state of the European Union, of the member states of the European Union. The massacre on October 7 was an extreme, outrageous event of these attacks by the Iranian mullah regime. The Israeli Defense Forces consists of people who have trained all their life to defend their country, who have thought all their life of how to do it to defend their people against terrorism. And they do it with military tactics and military strategies as a regular army of this very partner state of the European Union and many member states. I want peace. I want stability. I want democracy and rule of law. I want a situation of human dignity and freedom for each and everybody. That means for the future de-weaponization and demilitarization of the Palestinian territories, a path forward to self-capable economic structures, education, fight against anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in these regions, and then a security guarantee of Israel, and then maybe one day a two-state solution. And it means that the EU has to support the Abraham Accords, and the EU has to reconvene the EU-Israel Association Council and create a new EU-Israel Association Agreement to strengthen the positive powers which fight for rule of law, for democracy and against terrorism, the very same terrorism that's also threatening us, the citizens of the European Union.
So I might just remember the blue card when you are on the speakers list. So we have an extremely long debate. So there was one blue card by Özlem Demirel, but there was another card that was apparently withdrawn. Is that correct? Or is there another blue card for Mr. Mandel still? No? Okay, thank you. Dann ist als nächste Redner.
The next speaker is Ms. Insier.
Colleagues, more than 41,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza by Israel, the majority of whom are innocent children and women. Gaza's infrastructure lies in ruins with a staggering 75% destruction rate. The European Union must take a firm stance to end this bloodshed. We must also listen to the voices of the Israeli people who have taken to the streets calling for an end to the violence and the release of hostages. It is clear that both the far-right extremist Netanyahu government and the terrorist organization Hamas inflicted trauma on the population in both countries. Now is the time for actions to put an end to the suffering. Suspend all weapon exports to Israel until international law is respected. Even in warfare, there are rules that must be upheld. Immediately freeze the EU-Israeli Association Agreement. Implement restrictive measures against the Israeli extremist ministers Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. Reinforce sanctions against violent Israeli settlers in the occupied Palestinian territories. All EU member states must vote in favor of the resolution to be presented at the UN General Assembly on September 18th, demanding Israel to end its unlawful presence in the occupied territories within 12 months, according to the ICJ ruling. Support the ongoing work of ICC. Continue supporting UNRWA as no credible evidence has been presented to justify allegations against them. We must end this witch hunt. Maintain our support for the Palestinian Authority. Those advocating for cutting in funding to UNRWA and the PA are inadvertently aiding Hamas. And recognize Palestine. Finally, all member states should accept wounded Palestinians from Gaza. Unfortunately, my own Swedish government has rejected this proposal, despite, for example, Karolinska University Hospital being ready to provide care, just as they did for Ukrainian patients. Let's stand on the side of international law. Let's end the occupation.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. Tanja Correa.
Madam President, Mr. Commissioner, dear colleagues, o conflito que hoje...
The conflict that is ongoing in Gaza is a structural conflict and not a simple conflict that's a few years old. This conflict is deeply rooted, and it's based on hatred and mutual racism. Let's be very clear. And what has taken so long will not be solved in 2 days. It's not just a simple ceasefire that will be broken next time there's a problem in the Gaza Strip or in other Palestinian territories. We need to go deep into the conflict, find the root causes, and solve what needs to be solved, discuss what needs to be discussed, and not simply try to cover the sun with one finger. There was a certain balance that was broken on the 7th of October. And we always say that the crucial problem is going to be the hostages. Well, many of them have already been killed, some of them in a savage way, after ongoing negotiations were ongoing for a ceasefire, and this is unacceptable. And my question is, if you want Iran to stop being a regional power, that through its proxies such as Hamas, Hezbollah, and other groups, including its Islamic forces that cover 90% of these terrorist groups, if you don't want this to happen, then we need to negotiate, and we need to emphasize this. There are countries such as Egypt, Turkey, and the US which are negotiating. We need to act quickly. Let's reach real peace and not a simple unbreakable one. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. Rowson.
Dank u wel, voorzitter. Beste collega's, gisteren spraken we...
Thank you very much, President. Colleagues, yesterday we were talking about the future of the Jewish community in Europe in light of increasing anti-Semitism. Today we are talking about the future of Jewish people in their own country. This is what is at stake here. Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, they all want one thing, which is to wipe Israel off the map. Bearing this in mind, it is very clear on what side we should be in this conflict. We need to defend the survival of the Israeli state. We need to defend the right of Israel to defend itself. When it comes to giving up the fight, Hamas is certainly not willing to do that. They have rejected a ceasefire multiple times. They keep using civilians as human shields. They do not hesitate to use hospitals and schools for their terrorist activities. Blinken is doing his best to reach an agreement. It is laudable. Achieving the liberation of the hostages and security guarantees for Israel are two of the key conditions for me that need to be answered. Europe is sidelined in all of this. It's not really surprising seeing Europe's attitude. Mr. Borrell sent an official delegation this summer to the inauguration of the Iranian president, and in that way has legitimized that destabilizing regime. Thank you.
Would you accept a blue card from colleague Jovanovici? Yes? So please, for 30 seconds, the question.
Mulțumesc.
Thank you. You were speaking about respecting the state of Israel and respecting its territorial integrity. In 1946, the entire territory occupied today by Israel belonged to Palestine. In 1947, half of the Palestinian territory became Israel because of the plan of the United Nations. Between 1949 and 1967, more than 80% of Palestinian territory becomes Israel. In 2012, 10% is left of the territory of Palestine, even left is left to Palestine. So, who do we protect and whose territory? Yes, I asked it. Thank you.
Voorzitter, het lijkt me glashelder dat we de staat Israël hebben.
President, I said we need to protect the state of Israel. We're talking about the future of the whole region. What is important is to have a negotiated process where we can talk about the future of the Palestinian territories. That means, first of all, an end to terrorism. And if we are able to negotiate, then there might be prospects. But I don't think we should always talk about the occupied territories. I think we should talk about the contested territories, because historically and legally, Israel has claims on this land.
By colleague Zan, is it because you withdrew it? Was that? Do you want to ask a question? Okay, please go ahead.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, the colleague spoke about a situation in Gaza which does not correspond to reality. I've been there with a delegation of members of parliament, and we saw that humanitarian aid trucks don't go in, including those from the EU. Food doesn't go in, medicine doesn't go in, first aid doesn't go in, and the dead there are not only caused by the bombs, they are also caused by epidemics. There's a bathroom for every 400 people, and We don't even know how many dead people there are, because sometimes the morgues and hospitals have also been destroyed, and there is no authority that can tell us the actual number of dead people. So you are giving us an untrue picture of reality.
Please.
Voorzitter, ik ontken totaal niet dat er...
Madam President, I am not denying the fact that there is a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. I know that there is ongoing bombing. I know that the situation is very difficult in this region. I am not denying that. I said in my statement that we should hope to find an agreement, but I said that there were two clear preconditions. So firstly, Hamas needs to liberate all of the hostages, and second condition, there needs to be clear security guarantees given to Israel. What you are to Gaza, that is not the reality. It's often an issue of distribution of aid, and there are efforts that are thwarted by Hamas.
So please, colleague Andrews, you have waited for a while.
Madam President, Commissioner and colleagues, the landmark ruling of the International Court of Justice on July the 19th creates a positive obligation on the European Union and on all Member States and all countries that support multilateralism to take such action as they can to end the occupation of Gaza, the West Bank and East Jerusalem. The rule of law, consistently applied, requires that the Commission and the Council report to this House on the implications of that judgment. Doing nothing now actively erodes international humanitarian law. The only way to avoid degrading international humanitarian law is to act, to either ban trade with occupied territories, to stop arms sales, to sanction leadership. Sadly, the EU's response has been inaction. The legal question is settled for once and for all about the settlements. We have to do all in our power to bring it to an end, and that's why I call on the Irish government to act on the Occupied Territories Bill. We need to stop acting as a recruiting sergeant for extremist organisations and start working for peace. Thank you.
Dankeschön. Nächster Redner ist der Kollege Asensio.
Thank you. Colleague Asens Lotra.
President, Commissioner, for how much longer will Europe stop supporting Mr. Netanyahu, the butcher? Last Thursday, he murdered 7 UN employees, and as we've heard, there are 40,000 Palestinians dead, many of them women, children. How much longer will the international community tolerate this? How much longer will they ignore the rulings of the ECJ? The ICC, rather. And how many more dead people do we need? 100,000, a million? Because we need to tell the truth, and the truth is that it is a criminal hypocrisy to come here and cry about these dead while continuing to provide the arms that allow for this. It's a hypocrisy to sanction Putin and not Netanyahu. Victims are worth the same, whether they're Ukrainian or Palestinian, and it is hypocrisy to accept what the UN says on illegal outposts and then to finance them and to buy their products and to keep that EU agreement with Israel, which is a criminal agreement. We need to put an end to apartheid as the mayor of Barcelona did. If they did it, you can do it too. We need to call a spade a spade. And when we see a genocide, there is no halfway. We're either with the victim or the perpetrator.
Please do not exceed your speaking time in this way. Please take your scarf off. We talked about it. Thank you. Please, we are a house of speech here and not of symbols, etc. Thank you. We've always done it that way. Could you please take it? Thanks. This is colleague.
Madame la Présidente.
Madam President, Commissioner, colleagues, the additions, the agreements of 1916 up to the creation of Israel, expulsion of Palestinians, and this is a continuing Akbar. We have a political responsibility in the European countries in this colonial conflict. Genocide is ongoing in Gaza, and in the West Bank held up any political agreement. There's a genocide which has been documented and proved. The ICC's latest ruling proves that. We could have a ban on weapons exports to Israel, and we should call on Israel to respect international law, already voted through. And we should have self-determination for the Palestinian people. 4 generations of my family have been in this situation. How many more generations will have to go through that before we finally live up to our responsibilities?
Danke.
Thank you. The next speaker is Ms. Borvendik.
Just like in the case of the war between Russia and Ukraine, we need immediate ceasefire and then peace in the Gaza conflict. Since the bloody attacks in last October by Hamas, the number of victims has been more than 40,000. Most of them are Palestinian civilians, a lot of women and children. We do not question Israel's right to defend itself. However, the occupation of Gaza and the retaliating military action and the genocide cannot be justified with any sort of right to self-defense. They do not respect cultural heritage. They demolish, they destroy hospitals and schools. And while the Ukrainian-Russian conflict goes on live in the media in the West, we do not see a fraction of the suffering of Palestinian civilians, even though human rights and the right to the protection of human life is a right of everyone, regardless their skin tone, their religion, and their heritage. Now, instead of a two-state solution, Israel is waging a war against the Palestinian people. We call upon the responsible bodies of the EU and the UN to stop the bloodshed and act in the interest of peace. Thank you.
Dankeschön. Next.
Thank you. The next speaker is Ms. Firmenich.
Mehr als 40.000 Palästinenser.
More than 40,000 Palestinians have been killed by the Israeli army in Gaza. We're talking about women and children amongst them. Ursula von der Leyen, the US, Germany continue to support the extreme regime in power in Israel. When we see the terrible attack of Hamas and the fight against Islamic terrorism, but you cannot simply bomb away terrorism. You can't fight it in that way by perpetrating these massacres. What the war in Gaza is achieving, or aiming to achieve, to bring peace in the region in a sustainable way, but there needs to be a solution that secures Israel's right to exist while also seeing a Palestinian state on 1967 borders. My party, the Bundesrat Wagenknecht, wants to see an end of weapons being shipped to Israel, an immediate ceasefire and negotiations. There needs to be an end to the killing in Gaza. Thank you.
Nächste Rednerin ist die Kollegin Benteler.
Next speaker, Mrs. Benteler.
Sehr geehrte Frau Präsidentin, sehr geehrter Herr Kommissar, Commissioner President, today is a new start in terms of staff and programme. We need to start by thinking exactly what role the EU should be playing in the conflict in the Middle East. We should be reviewing the destination of EU money, for example. Development and humanitarian assistance is very important, and it's at a high level from the EU, but it must not be used in ways that allow it to be channeled into terrorist purposes. Monopolies are very rarely good, and the same is true of donor structures. If we want to achieve sustainable peace in the EU and in Gaza, we need to put pressure on the Arab states and all other parties to come together and to have some stake in generating peace. And that, to my mind, means we need to have a new structure for the donation of funds. And I hope the new commissioner will deal with this. It is not either just a question of management of refugees. We need to create jobs, we need to have better framework conditions for the economy, and we need to provide proper prospects for a genuine future for the people of Gaza. This can only happen if Israel is a stable partner and if the private economy is involved. So in Gaza, we need to achieve what we've achieved elsewhere. We've got to ensure that there are genuine prospects for people of having a job and a life in their homeland, and they're not going to be driven away by hate speech and attacks. We also need to have a much more coherent and focused policy to support the Palestinian Authority. This is something which I think is very important and is not sufficiently addressed in our current packages. We absolutely need to do more than what we've been doing just now and play our full part. Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. Howell.
Gracias,
Thank you very much, Madam President. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the first time that I speak before this House, and I would like to do so on behalf of those who cannot speak in this House. We denounced the attack on October 7th, and we still do that. We stand by the side of the Israeli families that have hostages and who are suffering, but I would like to ask you to reserve the same unreserved condemnation to the reaction of the Israeli government. More than 41,000 people have lost their lives, thousands of people are injured, and many have disappeared, most of which are children and women. 9 out of 10 people are displaced in the Gaza Strip. Forced displacement is considered to be a war crime. Killing civilians, journalists, and humanitarian staff haven't come to an end. They're continuing, and we've seen what's been happening in schools and how people count the dead by weighing human remains found under the rubble. We have to be committed to rights and freedoms. We have to have the right to protect peace. Otherwise, we would be setting an irreversible precedent. And in other contexts, we condemn leaders, but we're not condemning Netanyahu. These are double standards we don't understand. We're blocking humanitarian aid. There are human rights violations. There is more and more hate speech, and none of this should be allowed. We have to denounce the occupation of the Palestinian territories and illegal settlements that fly in the face of the UN Security Council resolutions. We've got to recognize the Palestinian state within the framework of a two-state solution. We mustn't stigmatize UN agencies. We have to overhaul the EU-Israel Association Agreement. And no, it's not anti-Semitism to denounce what's happening in Palestine. Otherwise, we would be doing it, we would be committing anti-Semitism against the Palestinians who are also Semites. We want a ceasefire. Palestine is not a contested territory.
White line. Or are you going to stay against also the resolutions of United Nations? Come on. Who's going to respect us like this? Thank you.
Dankeschön. Nächster Redner ist der...
Thank you very much. Next speaker, Mr. Gerardo Vidal.
Muchas gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm somewhat surprised. I am an MEP. I was previously a Spanish MP. I've come here to express a political point of view, but previous speakers have insisted on what the EU has to do, what the Parliament has to do. Perhaps I could invite them to consider that the first thing that the EU has to do is stop financing the Palestine National Authority, whilst this authority continues to use its funds to finance the Pay for Slay project. They have to put a stop to their assassinations, to their murders, because they're paying for these, they're funding these, but furthermore, they're funding these so-called martyrs. And I think with the degree of decency, we should be calling them terrorists. They and their families are paid in accordance to the number of lives they have taken. These terrorists can ensure that their families have income for years to come. So the EU should stop financing terrorism. It would be great if Hamas was a peaceful organization, but the reality is it's a terrorist organization. Those are the terms which we have set here. It would be great if children were not used as human shields, but when the bombs fall, it is the Hamas terrorists who hide out, and there are many, many places they could hide. They've got hundreds of kilometers of tunnels which they have built using the money provided by international aid, money which is designed to educate these children, build infrastructure. They hide in these tunnels, and these children are indoctrinated, taught hate in these schools, and taught that their family members may die as martyrs. We wish this wasn't the case, but on the 7th of October, Hamas launched an unprecedentedly violent, brutal attack. This cannot be compared with anything which had been seen or done before, and the voice of the West has always been, yes, Israel has the right to defend itself, but, and whenever we talk about the Jewish people, there's always a but.
Eine blue card von...
Thank you. There's a blue card from...
Wir haben die Regel, dass...
From Mr. Salani, but the rule that we have is when we have a very long debate, we don't give blue cards to anybody who's already on the speaker's list. So I'm afraid I can't allow that, and the same holds for our colleague Miranda Path, who also requested a blue card question. The next speaker is Mr. Pelletier.
Le monde entier.
Thank you. The world has its heart torn apart by the suffering of the Holy Land. There are too many victims of the war which was unleashed by Hamas in October last year. But very rapidly, we've seen that the left is persuaded by the causes of international terrorism and by those who say that it's not right to ban or to impose the veil. It's not right to treat in a certain way people who have inherited thousands of years of history and whose legacy that is. And therefore, there are many who struggle to lead by example or to identify a proper way forward. There are those who seek back in history imaginary debts of a historical nature, which they invoke together with historical memory in order to assert the rights of those on whose side they are against those against whom they stand. We support all efforts to achieve peace in the Middle East, but we will also stand out against anyone who wants to bring the Intifada into the ancient Christian lands. Europe and the Middle East must never be the victim of this sort of atrocity. Thank you.
Der nächste Redner ist der Kollege Getter.
Next speaker, Mr. Getter.
Mes chers collègues, il ne s'agit...
Ladies and gentlemen, it's no longer about deploring this set of crimes, one crime after the other. It's not about condemning, but about acting, and to therefore go back to demanding long-lasting peace. and a coexistence of these two peoples who are disputing this land that we call the Holy Land, and to understand that the only possible solution is the two-state solution as defended by the UN, the Arab League, our union, and its 27 capitals. At the moment, people are saying this is becoming more and more a utopia. Yes, but it's necessary and not more of a pie in the sky than Franco-German reconciliation, which led to our union. If we want Europe to make its comeback as a player on the international scene, we've got to re-trigger the peace process that started 30 years ago. And I'm very pleased that our president recently said that they're committed to this two-state solution, and that Kaja Kallas is talking about coexistence of Palestine and Israel. Thank you.
Nächste Rednerin ist die Kollegin Miranda.
Thank you. The next speaker is Ms. Miranda Paz.
Comisario. Commissioner. Madam von der Leyen, ladies and gentlemen, this is not a war, this is genocide. As a genocide, let me show you this picture, Commissioner. Please look at it. I'm sure you've seen it many times before. How about this picture?
Where we speak and it's not for symbols or anything. I know, please.
I know, but es la realidad. La realidad. That's reality. The reality is we have a litany of international crimes. That's the reality. If you don't want to look at the pictures themselves, no problem. But it's the reality. More than 41,000 people have been murdered. And I am very much concerned that there are MEPs such as Mr. Gerauda, who has just taken the floor, who has been paid by lobbyists who have come here to speak, to deny reality. Because what we need here is a little bit of humanity from our MEPs. We need a ceasefire. This abandoned people need humanitarian aid. You haven't been to Gaza like I have, looking at the lorries, that more than 2,000 lorries containing humanitarian aid. Israel is violating international law. And what we have to do is very clear. We have to suspend the EU-Israel Association Agreement. We have to have an arms embargo. We have to break up diplomatic relations with all countries in the EU. When we talk about peace, we cannot talk about in the same breath as genocide or a murdered people. Those who listen to what we're saying here in Brussels, let us say it loud and clear, not in our name. We say no to genocide. That is why we have voted against this European Commission, who has sat back and watched while this genocide unfolded. Thank you.
Der nächste Redner ist der Kollege.
The next speaker is Mr. Bottinger.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, President. When I was at school, I was told, of course, that Europe was human rights, international law, democracy, the rule of law. And this is what diplomats and politicians the world over have been telling us down the years. But when you look at Palestine, when you look at Gaza, and when you see what the European Union is condoning, then you are moved to wonder, because there, the genocide that is taking place would be impossible without the effective support of the West. This is genocide that's being perpetrated by Israel with the support of the Western countries. The International Court has spoken. It ought to have issued an arrest warrant against Netanyahu. It's already said that colonization and settlements are illegal, those done by Israel, but the Parliament defends these policies and simply ignores these deaths. It effectively spits on them as if they were worthless. Is it okay because it's your allies who are committing the crimes, you can then just turn a blind eye to it? Is this really what Europe is? Is this really the values of our Europe? How can you actually look your children in the eye when you get back home in the evening? How can you say goodnight to them with a clear conscience? I fail to understand that. Thank you. Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. Gražulis.
Aš norėjau jūsų paklausti,
Ar nors viena salė yra tikintis?
I would like to ask you, does anyone believe here that the best intelligence service, Mossad, knew about the attack, did not know about the attack? Also, I want to ask why the government of Israel and why the military of Israel let for 10 hours for the massacre of Israeli citizens to go on. Maybe it was a very well-planned provocation so that Israel would have its hands free to commit what they are doing now on the Gaza Strip, and so that the international community would accept it. Don't you think so? The killings, they are killing the children, the elderly people, destroying civil buildings and hospitals, and all of this is perpetrated by the Israeli government, and the world is staying silent. Immediately, the European Union should recognize the state of Palestine and demand the release of all the hostages taken by Hamas.
Thank you. The next speaker.
Izraela proti civilnému palestínskému obyvateľstvu. Vyše 40 000 mŕtvych, väčšina z nich ženy a deti.
Thank you. Thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of women and children have died in Palestine. And here in the Parliament, we are simply uttering empty words once again. Those on the right and those on the left can be equally guilty of this. Those on the right simply utter hate speech and fail to recognize that there should be sovereignty for many areas in the Middle East, such as Palestine and Syria. And yet what happens, Israel gets more and more weapons deliveries, and more men, women and children are dying. And this is not only in Gaza, this is also in the West Bank. And it is absolutely clear to all that this is utter hypocrisy. The Palestinians have the right to freedom, and our moral duty is to battle against fascism wherever it rears its head and to promote peace. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Madam President. Until last week, I was in Jordan for the election observation mission. I can tell you that no country is better placed to gauge the consequences of the war between Israel and Hamas. Over there, the risk of spillover into the region is palpable. The refugee situation is a striking example. Jordan is still hosting almost 1.2 million Syrian refugees, and the current displacement of Palestinians could destabilize the country and the region as a whole. Not to mention the fact that the refugees are already facing a funding crisis. Similarly, the growing instability in Lebanon, which hosts 1.5 million of the 6 million Syrian refugees, has led many of these refugees to try to reach Cyprus, raising the risk of further tragedies as they cross the Mediterranean Sea. This, in addition to the arms smuggling and drug trafficking routes crossing the border between Jordan and Syria, which threatens border security. There is therefore an urgent need to restore stability to the region, which can only be achieved through a peace agreement, including the unconditional release of the hostages. Only in this way we will be able to build a lasting political solution, that is to say, two-state solution. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank. Nächste Rednerin ist die Kollegin.
Thank you. The next speaker is Ms. Tomido.
Signora Presidente.
Madam President, almost a year after the terrible attacks of the 7th of October, a humanitarian tragedy is unfolding in the Gaza Strip. More than 40,000 deaths, little access to food, healthcare, electricity, drinking water and basic sewage systems. 75% of infrastructure necessary for essential services have been destroyed. We cannot allow this situation to become normalized. We cannot allow Gaza to become simply a cry of grief. It is our moral and political duty as representatives of European citizens not to remain silent. This is why we repeat the call for an immediate ceasefire as supported by the UN and others. We cannot be afraid of calling for sanctions for those responsible political players. If we don't take these steps, then we simply cannot sleep peacefully. We cannot allow even the slightest sign of anti-Semitism. Calling for accountability for the Israeli government simply means doing what should have been done by the international community whenever we talk about flagrant violations of fundamental rights. If Europe wants to be a decisive player in the Middle East, and if we want to facilitate diplomatic solutions, long-term solutions, we need to take decisions. In order to do this, we have to call for the protection of civilians, the opening of humanitarian corridors, and the reintroduction of borders in Gaza, a stop to all forms of violence, and we have to fight tirelessly for peace. The time has come. Thank you.
Colleague Stechowski, I saw your blue card.
Mr. Stechowski.
We have a very long speakers list, and we don't take speakers for blue cards who are on the speakers list. Okay? Der nächste Redner ist dann der Kollege Tynkönen.
The next speaker is Mr. Tynkönen.
Madam President, for almost a year now, scores of hostages have remained in dark tunnels in the hands of Hamas. Although shocking, the horrific terrorist attack on Israel did not come as a surprise. In 2013, the world-famous Pew Research Center polled Muslims all around the world. One result in particular was quite shocking. 40% of the Palestinian Muslims said that the suicide bombing in defense of Islam is often or sometimes justified. So is this any surprise that something like October 7th came to pass? The border wall between Israel and the Gaza Strip exists for a reason, so that the Israelis wouldn't constantly have to fear for their lives. Israel has offered the Palestinian Authority a two-state solution time and time again to no avail. The Palestinians simply don't want it. To them, the only solution seems to be an intifada. If Hamas came out of hiding and laid down their weapons, the fighting would cease in an instant and the humanitarian situation could start significantly improving. The whole world seems to want peace. The only question is, does Hamas?
Excuse me, do you accept a blue card by colleague Zaramo?
For sure.
Please.
Arvoisa rouva puheenjohtaja, kysyisin.
Madam Chair, I would like to ask my colleague that when Israel has settled and occupied the West Bank and has driven Palestinians from their homes against UN resolutions, and Israel has been establishing an embargo on Gaza. Gaza has been called the greatest prison, the biggest prison in the world, and Israel has breached international justice time and again, killed Palestinians and prevented the two-state solution from taking place. Israel only wants a one-state solution. They don't accept Palestinians as being people. They don't want the two-state solution. Netanyahu is popular and is living because he wants to oppress Palestinians. So why do you advocate for breaking UN resolutions?
Israel on monikulttuurinen yhteiskunta.
Israel is a multicultural society, and within that society, different kinds of populations can coexist peacefully. So I can say the same thing in Finnish that I just said in English. 40% of Muslims in Palestine approve the fact that you can do suicide bombings in order to defend Islam. And we have seen the development. We have seen that all the time from the West Bank, from Gaza, from the states around the area. They are launching attacks on Israel. Like October 7th, that was one good or bad example of these actions, and that does not justify a two-state solution.
So, die nächste Rednerin ist die Kollegin Jo.
The next speaker is Ms. Jovera.
A veste, kaj držim v rokah, kolegice in kolegi? 14 strani podatkov mrtvih umorjenih.
Thank you very much. 14 pages of the names of babies killed. These are children that hadn't even turned one, and we would have even more pages. We're talking about 34,000 victims, more than 11,000 children, and these are the figures. In fact, more have died, and those who are alive are suffering terrible consequences of the collapse of the health sector, and also because of malnutrition. There isn't enough food. Many of you are wringing your hands and deploring what is happening, but at the same time, then you are talking about the right that Israel has. I am ashamed, even though I'm a member of this House, although it should be you who should be ashamed of yourselves. I'm not going to remain silent. I'm not going to remain silent in this institution until, together with this list of babies that have been killed, have a list of sanctions against Israel.
Thank you. Next speaker is Mr. Orlando.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you very much, President. We are witnessing nothing less than an absolute tragedy in the West Bank and in Gaza. The terrorists of Hamas, of course, we condemn, but they bring us in mind of decades of suffering wherein the Palestinians' rights have been flouted and ridden roughshod over. This has obviously contributed towards Hamas's response. The European Union has got to recognise the decisions of the International Court of Justice. They have unequivocally condemned the occupation of Palestine by Israel and its actions there. Tens of parliamentarians have also talked in terms of war crimes perpetrated by the Israeli government, which have undermined any prospect of peace, a recognition of the state of Palestine, which the United Nations has been working painstakingly towards on the basis of the Oslo agreements for decades. The Arab states need to recognise Israel and its right to existence, yes. This is uncontrovertible, but it has also got to recognise that Netanyahu's government is violent, perpetrating apartheid, and is therefore not legitimate in this way. It's contributing to a crazy arms race, the escalation of war, riding roughshod over democratic rights and human rights, causing hundreds, thousands of deaths of civilians, men, women and children in Gaza, and a desperate situation where the ripple effects are transcending all the borders. The word genocide barely expresses the reality on the ground there, and the terrifying and awful extermination of millions of people in that area whose rights have been completely trampled underfoot, flying in the face of every single provision of international law which has existed down the course of history. Thank you. Thank you. The next speaker is Ms. Montero.
Gracias, Presidenta, Comisario, colegas. Hablar de guerra en Gaza, Comisario.
Thank you, Chair. When we talk about the Gaza Strip, we are simply protecting the genocidal state of Israel. If a sovereign state kills 40,000 people, half of them children and babies, when they destroy 50% of schools and 50 of the roads, as well as flattening houses, when they forcibly displace 80% of the population, when they prevent access to humanitarian aid, water and food. This isn't a humanitarian crisis. This is a genocide that is only possible thanks to the complicity of Europe and the US, which provide economic, military and political support to those committing the genocide. This is a simple hypocrisy, President. This means that you are more concerned about the fact that my colleague shows a photo in the plenary. You're more worried about that than the fact that a genocide is taking place. So why do you maintain the economic and trade agreement with Israel? Why do you not take Israel to court? Why do you not express solidarity with the Palestinian people? Today, the Ministry of Health for Gaza published the list of over 40,000 victims. This is just half the list, those up to the age of 29 who have been murdered. When will you stop helping Israel commit this genocide? Thank you.
Dear colleagues, I would just like to remind you about the rules of procedure, and we're not allowed to express political messages besides speaking. The next speaker will be Mr. Sean Kelly for 2 minutes. The floor is yours.
The dire situation that continues to unfold in the Gaza Strip is deeply troubling. This conflict, now in its 11th month, has led to an appalling humanitarian disaster. Over 40,800 Palestinians have lost their lives, with more than 94,000 injured. The devastating impact extends beyond Gaza, spilling over into the West Bank, exacerbating an already dire humanitarian crisis. As Fine Gael MEPs have previously communicated in our letter to President Ursula von der Leyen, it is evident that urgent action is required. The International Court of Justice has made a clear ruling. Israel's continued occupation of Palestinian territories is unlawful, yet the suffering persists. MEPs must now intensify our efforts. The EU must leverage its significant economic influence to reassess and potentially revise its trade agreements with Israel. Our trade relationships must align with our commitment to human rights and international law. Ireland's position remains unwavering. We condemn the terrorist attacks by Hamas and call for the immediate release of all hostages. However, we also assert that Israel's response must adhere to international law, limiting force to what is necessary and proportionate. The European Union must use all its diplomatic resources to bring about an immediate and lasting ceasefire. The two-state solution is the best avenue for peace in the region. Every day, this policy slips away, and those who support peace must stand up now before it is too late. We owe it to the innocent caught up in the daily atrocities to bring about ceasefire and a peace and a two-state solution.
Thanks a lot. And the next speaker is Ms. Van Brempt for 2 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Collega's, ik denk dat bijna de helft van de mensen...
Colleagues, I think that at least half the speakers this evening have mentioned the horrifying figures, 40,000 minimum completely innocent victims, and 30,000 of them are young people, women and children, more than 30,000. And behind these anonymous figures, colleagues, there are real people, there are families which have been torn apart. At the beginning of this conflict, a lot of the members in this parliament spoke out in support of these victims, and we continue to do this on a daily basis, arguing the case for a ceasefire, arguing the case for the speeding up of the supplying of humanitarian aid. But to the Commission, I would say this. What is lacking is action. Here in this Parliament, and I hope that you understand this, we constantly say that you can't use double standards. This morning we were talking about Ukraine, and we're very proud of the fact that there's been unity across the Parliament and there's been unity in the Council in terms of our stance towards Ukraine. Yet, a year after the invasion of Ukraine, we had at least 10 sanctions packages in place, quite rightly so. But now, how many sanctions packages have been implemented against the extreme right government of Netanyahu? Not one single one since last autumn. Therefore, it is more than high time that we took action and that we put our words into actions. All the human rights clauses in the association agreement need to be invoked as a basis for action, and we really need to suspend this association agreement until we see something better happening in the Middle East. We must stop exporting weapons, we must implement sanctions, and we must do nothing more that is going to cause greater tragedy, greater suffering and more death. We have to stand up for principles and act upon them. Thank you. Mr. Kelleher, for 1 minute.
It's almost a year since the barbaric attacks of Hamas on the 7th of October, which killed over 1,100 people and took hundreds of people hostages, many that are still in captivity, and I call for their immediate release. And the subsequent Israeli invasion of Gaza has been described as a genocide, as a war crime. It's been described by politicians by that, but equally the International Criminal Court has raised genuine concerns about Israel's activity in Gaza. The International Court of Justice has cited Israeli politicians in terms of the illegal occupation in the West Bank. But being quite truthful, the mandate that this House has had and the Commission has been dishonest, because we have done nothing in the last 5 years to address what is an illegal invasion of Palestinian lands in the West Bank. The European Union has done nothing to advance a two-state solution. It has sat in its hands and has watched the occupation of West Bank by settlers supported by the Israeli army and supported by the Israeli government, and we have done nothing. We have an Israeli-EU trade association agreement which has in its body of the articles human rights obligations. I have seen no effort by the European Union to address that issue. It is shameful, but it's more shameful that it continues.
Colleagues, we have a long speakers list. Please stick to the time. I would be very grateful. And the next speaker is Ms. Kuhnke. For 1 minute, please.
Fru talman, om vi inte...
Madam President, if we do not act in the face of this humanitarian disaster that is unfolding before our very eyes, if we give the impression that this is something normal, then who are we, and what does international law actually mean? What does it mean when we say that we have an international law-based order? What has happened to compassion and empathy? It's been a while now that the EU and its member states could have done something. We could have suspended our association agreement with Israel. We could have sanctioned ministers. We could have increased the support provided. We could have harnessed UN troops. We could have done everything possible to make sure that there is a two-state solution, a sustainable and long-lasting solution, and of course demand the release of all hostages. The least that we can do is to make sure that we do everything we can to take care of those who are injured and ill in Gaza. It's the least we can do from a moral point of view. Madam President, this is a well-known story. Listen, when the Germans go to Paris, a Nazi officer went to see Picasso in his workshop, and when he saw Guernica, this small town that Franco raised, he said, "Did you paint this?" "No," he said, "you did this." So Gaza is the new Guernica of our days. And in the future, when some future Picasso is asked a similar question, he will turn around and say that these heinous crimes were carried out by murderer Netanyahu and his allies, the EU, NATO, and so on. In the Gaza rubble, we have buried the last remnants of humanity of the European Union. And my question is, how much more bloodshed to make you feel overwhelmed and distraught? Why are you still supporting Netanyahu, who's a war criminal?
Thanks a lot. And the next speaker is Ms. Benjumea for 2 minutes, please.
Gracias, Presidenta. Thank you, President. Commissioner. On the 7th of October 2023, Hamas, a terrorist organization, murdered more than 1,200 Israelis and kidnapped more than 250 innocent civilians, including children, in a bloody and inhuman attack against the democratic state of Israel. It's important to remember this date, this horrific attack, so we don't lose sight of it and fall into the trap of those who want us to forget this attack, because it's this terrorist massacre which triggered the legitimate reaction of Israel, its legitimate defense of its borders, freedoms and citizens, its defense of its existence as a state. Let me be very clear. Israel is a democratic state fighting against a terrorist organization which has turned the civilian population into a human shield, a civil population which is suffering from the terrible consequences of the war. We feel immensely sorry for the civilian population, and we want to provide them with as much support as possible. A civilian population which is calling for the end of this war, of course. But the end of the war can only come if the security of the state of Israel is protected, if it can exist in peace and stability, and if these terrorist organizations are done away with. We need a commitment from the EU and from all Western democracies, a commitment that they will defend democracy, freedom and human rights in the Middle East. When faced with terrorist organizations such as Hamas and Hezbollah, we always have to stand with democracy and freedom. Thank you.
We have a blue card. Do you want to accept, Alex? Mr. Saliba, please wait. Mr. Saliba, please wait. Benjumea, do you want to take a blue card? Would you like to take a blue card? Yeah, good. It's, I give the floor to Bosanac, 317.
Sorry, I thought there were no blue cards before. In the previous, they said there were no blue cards also.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, yeah.
Zahvaljujem. Ovdje sam, kolegice. It's very interesting that you are supporting the Israeli government, and how do you then explain that hundreds of thousands of Israeli people are on the streets protesting the decisions of this government? So we do not have criticism against the government of Israel from outside, but from their own people. So how do you explain that?
La mejor prueba de que el Estado de Israel es una democracia.
That's the proof that Israel is a democratic state. Their citizens can take to the street and protest against their government's actions whenever they wish to. They can protest against their governments, they can have elections, they can change their government. That is the proof that we have to continue to defend the democracy of Israel. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for Gaza.
And now it's Mr. Ayos Saliba for 2 minutes, please.
Grazie, signor.
Thank you, Madam President. This is my first opportunity in this legislature to have the opportunity to discuss and to analyze the genocide which is underway in the Gaza Strip. This is a genocide which has already caused so many deaths. More than 40,000 persons have been massacred, and some 39,000 have been injured. I cannot even begin to imagine the terror that these people in Gaza are experiencing. Refugee centers, bombardments, shelters. Very often, the civilians themselves are the target. Bombardments and bombings of even hospitals until recently, and of course the collapse of basic necessities as well as water shortages and obviously food shortages. These are none other than measures which go against the most fundamental principles of international law. And therefore I ask this Parliament to be more vociferous so that ultimately it would condemn most strongly and clearly what is going on in the Gaza Strip against an innocent people. I would like to see more discussion and more condemnation in this Parliament of what the journalists are facing. Palestinian journalists in the Gaza Strip, over 100, have been butchered just by doing their job. Where is the condemnation? Where is our shout, our appeal to be able to protect broadcasters and journalists? And therefore I believe, as the European Union, as the European Parliament, we must be more vociferous in condemning this genocide. We'll call it as it is, we name it, and we continue appealing so that we will have a ceasefire, an immediate ceasefire, before seeing more innocent victims losing their lives. Thank you very much.
Ladi, please, for 1 minute.
Dear President, Commissioner, esteemed colleagues, it's very interesting that a government that is defined as a democratic by the white Europeans actually gets a carte blanche to kill as many as possible, and still we call it a democracy respecting human rights. 2 days ago, a document with 649 pages was released with the names, the ages, the ID numbers, the genders of the people who have been killed since the October 7th in only Gaza. 14 pages of them were filled with names of children who has not reached the age of 1 year. And none of these children had a gun in their hands. And still you are discussing and saying Hamas and Israel's self-defense. Until now, we have over 40,000 people killed in Gaza. Despite this, some groups of this House had the audacity to remove the term ceasefire from the title from this debate. I mean, this is showing the ugliness of our double standards here in the EU. And we still allow for weapons to go to Israel. The same government led by Netanyahu and his far-right extremist government that are facing arrest warrants from the International Criminal Court. It is the same government that has flagrantly disregarded international law and the rulings of International Court of Justice. We must call for a ceasefire now. We must end the killings of the Palestinians now.
Thank you. Let me remind you once again about the speaking time. Please stick to a speaking time. Next speaker is Ms. Strick for 1 minute. The floor is yours.
President, Commission. On the 19th of July, the ICJ gave a legal confirmation to the obvious, that the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories is illegal and should end immediately. States should do anything to avoid and stop the destruction, the massacre in Gaza and the occupation. Yet we have seen 2 more months of complete inaction by the Commission and the Member States. 2 more months of asking politely if Israel could please stop murdering innocent Palestinians and bombing schools. The time of asking politely is over. There's only one language that this aggressor understands: international sanctions. We need to sanction those responsible for the war crimes, including Netanyahu and the responsible Israeli ministers. We need to stop selling arms. We need to freeze the association agreement. We simply need to start respecting international law if we expect anyone else to do so in the future.
Thank you very much. And for 1 minute, Ms. Demirel.
Dankeschön, Frau Präsidentin.
Thank you very much, President. It is clear that it's not enough just to keep cutting the grass. At some point, you need to root it out at the very roots. This is what the Israeli defense minister said in terms of their actions in the West Bank. So this was really a clear indication to the West Bank that their day-to-day military and political actions are going to change. And it's not just alleged military infrastructure that they've gone for. It's universities, it's medical infrastructures. Gaza has nothing of these sorts of things. No hospitals, no education institutes, no medical care. Everything is destroyed. Their homes, their hospitals, their schools, and this genocidal war perpetrated by Israel against the people of Palestine has been ongoing for virtually a year. And for this whole year, the narrative in Germany has been that this is some kind of legitimate war against Hamas. But there isn't Hamas in the West Bank. This is simply not true. And the German government is complicit in this. It is also responsible for the supply of these weapons that are killing people in the West Bank and in Gaza.
I will have to close down your microphone if you keep on going over your speaking time. You have to respect the colleagues and the rules of procedure here in the House. And now I will give the floor to Mr. Zedekovsky for 1 minute, please. 1 minute and 30, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Commissioner, it's unbelievable what has been happening at this day and age. Who is to blame? Who is the terrorist? When somebody commits a terrorist act, he is a terrorist. Hamas committed a terrorist act. They are terrorists. And it surprises me when somebody in the 21st century endorses terrorists. And they use propaganda in European capitals. And then they mouth this propaganda saying that Hamas fights for the freedom of Palestinian peoples. My grandfather was in a concentration camp. I have several members of my family who were killed by the Nazi regime. And comparing Israel with the Nazis is absolutely impossible. It doesn't fit at all. And all of you, left and right, those of you who have rather extremist views, please leave these views. Let them go. Because this is not our war. Those who are in the European Parliament, we should contribute to peace by defeat of terrorism, so that once and for all we have a two-state solution of Israel and Palestine. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I would like to let you know that those of you who have already had a blue card will not be given it again. We are under time pressure here today. And now I will give the floor to Mr. Oreo Dan for 1 minute, please.
Israel now. Sanction Israel now. Madam President, this is my first speech in this chamber, and I wanted those to be my first words. What is happening in Gaza is nothing short of a total humanitarian catastrophe. 41,000 Palestinians have been killed. Gaza has been reduced to rubble. 2 million Gazans are being left to starve, without electricity, without clean water, without a sewage system, or without even a single fully functional hospital. The EU's response to this crisis has been totally inadequate and unacceptable, and this is the reason why I voted against Ursula von der Leyen to remain as President of the European Commission. Only real, tangible action against Israel can stop the suffering. This means scrapping the EU-Israel Association Agreement. It means sanctioning key individual ministers within the Netanyahu regime for their role in inciting war crimes and genocidal acts. And crucially, it means economic sanctions against the State of Israel. The EU is Israel's largest trading partner. Nearly 30% of Israel's exports were sold to the EU. At its core, the EU is a project of peace. If we are serious about peace in Gaza, justice for Palestinians and a two-state solution, we must be serious about sanctions against Israel.
Please, colleagues. I will give the floor now to Ms. Louiseau for 1 minute.
Je reviens de Jordanie, où les
I've just come back from Jordan, where the Muslim Brotherhood had an historic victory. Why? Because the pictures of Gaza are being around the world and breaking hearts. We saw demonstrations in Israel. At the moment, no hostages have been released. Hostages are dying, and that is also heartbreaking. To support Israel, and that is my case, means that we mustn't give in when it comes to the security, but we mustn't support the blind position of Netanyahu and his right-wing allies that are destroying Gaza. And to support the Palestinians, which I want to do, isn't to support Hamas terrorists or other allies that are causing chaos in the region. And it's not tantamount to closing the eyes to what the Palestinian Authority is doing, which is an authority only in name. We need to be able to speak to the language of truth both to the Palestinians and the Israelis. That's what the EU should do, and we should be able to do that without waiting for the US to decide on our behalf, because the Middle East is on our doorstep, and the terrible situation there will affect us more than anywhere else. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And next speaker is Mr. Marino for 1 minute.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. For months now, we have seen absolutely unbearable images of death and of violence on a daily basis, and the hatred escalates on a daily basis likewise. How could it not? President, imagine being a mother in the Gaza Strip, and imagine seeing your child running towards you, having lost an arm or having been seriously injured by the exploding bombs nearby. This is something which will be with them for the rest of their lives, however long that is. Netanyahu is the worst friend to Israel. He is like a toxin to the country, which is keeping himself in place. He is a war criminal, and he is murdering millions of innocent people through the war that he is perpetrating and the desperation and destruction that he is creating likewise. Israel, yes, did have to suffer a terrorist attack, but it is Netanyahu himself who is responsible for the genocide of the Palestinian people. We absolutely must and have a duty to stop him. Thank you.
Next speaker is Mr. Sokol for 1 minute and... Oh, sorry, no, I was too fast. It's Mr. Barena Arza for 1 minute, please. And I do apologize.
Gracias, Presidenta, Comisaria.
Thank you, President, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen. The EU, and in particular this Parliament, is obliged to denounce the genocide being led by Israel against the Palestine state with the complicity of the international environment. Gaza has been attacked and bombed by Israel, and this has to stop now. The pressure applied by the EU against Israel should take the form of the suspension of the 2000 association agreement, the free trade agreement with Israel, whilst this genocide in Palestine continues. This did not begin on the 7th of October last year. Going back to the status quo is not an option. I would like to take this opportunity to stress the importance of the International Conference for Peace in Palestine, which will be held on the 19th of October in Brussels. We have to continue work towards the end of a genocide in Palestine with an immediate ceasefire. We have to find a solution which will allow the Palestinian people to enjoy its own state protected by the international community. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now it's Mr. Sokol for 1 minute and 30 seconds, please.
President, colleagues, We are approaching the first anniversary of a terrorist attack in which Hamas killed more than 1,000 people, mostly civilians, and caught a lot of people. This was targeted against the Jewish people. The European Parliament, in its resolution from January, took a clear stand and asked for a ceasefire, but with the condition that all hostages be released and Hamas will be discontinued. And now, to this very day, Hamas is calling for the killing of Jews. This is why we need to be in line with all the victims, and Hamas has long ceased to be only an Israeli problem, and we have been witnesses to that within the last few months especially. Most Islamists, but also the extreme left, are spreading hate speech in European cities, and this is why we need to say stop with that and stop threatening the European way of life.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Ms. Annunziata for 1 minute, please.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I'm not going to repeat the words denouncing what is occurring and what is happening in the Gaza Strip, what's happening to the Palestinians, what happened on the 7th of October, and so on. Indignation and denouncing what is happening doesn't lead to peace. I think that societies have to get together. It's societies that change and force governments to forge peace. And therefore, Madam President, in the Palestinian people, in Palestine, there is change, there is reform, and that is positive. And then we have the changes in Israeli society. We're still talking about Israel here, but there isn't one single Israel. Israel isn't just Netanyahu, and this has been proven very clearly by the families of the hostages that have rallied together and protested and that want elections, that are clamoring for elections. I think all of this is new to positive developments. Thank you.
The next speaker is Mr. McNamara for 1 minute, please.
Madam President, colleagues, Israel has a right to defend itself. Of that, there is absolutely no doubt. However, it must, in defending itself, act within the confines and constraints of international law. And it is not doing that at the moment. And we, the European Union, are standing idly by and watching that unfold. The attacks of October 7th by Hamas were barbaric. They were designed to provoke a reaction, and they have achieved that. Likewise, the hostage-taking is barbaric, and the hostages should be released. However, none of that justifies the Israeli response in Gaza. The orders of the ICJ of the 26th of January and the 28th of March, made pursuant to the Genocide Convention, point to the fact that Israel is not acting within the constraints of international law. The EU Trade Association Agreement with Israel is founded upon respect for the principles of the United Nations Charter, yet the European Union refuses to act on that and thereby jeopardises its own claim to be founded on the principles of rule of law. We must act, colleagues, to prevent what is happening and unfolding in Gaza. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Mr. Bosanac for 1 minute, please.
Thank you, Vice President. Colleagues, many things were said in the last 11 months after the 7th of October. Many of you have said that Israel's behavior is unacceptable. We've heard international courts. We hold calls for ceasefire, the release of hostages, and the result is Israel is not doing anything and is sending a clear message: we just don't care. So what are we going to do now? Will we just keep passing judgments, or we're going to do something concrete? We have to exert pressure in order to stop the massacre in Gaza. But I would like to tell you something else. I would like to tell you that thousands of Israeli people are protesting against Netanyahu, because Israel is not only Netanyahu. But I would also like to turn your attention to the Palestinians who are critical to Hamas, because Palestine is not only Hamas. And these people provide a solution. We need to support them. And Commissioner, we need to support these people because they are the only ones who can make some change from inside.
The next speaker is Mr. Della Valle for 1 minute. Thank you, President. Colleagues, in the Middle East, it's not a question of looking towards escalation. We're already way beyond that. There's open warfare being perpetrated by Netanyahu against the Palestinians, and yet there are people who are still denying this. They are utter hypocrites, and worse, they're complicit in this genocide. There have been tens of thousands, 40,000 lives lost in Gaza that we know of, that are accounted for. There are 100,000 people injured. There will be thousands, tens of thousands more dead. Houses by these tens of thousands razed to the ground, and Israel continues to occupy Palestinian territories illegally. The change of the status quo on Temple Mount is yet another illustration of the fact that Israel doesn't want peace, and the EU has therefore got to decide once and for all which side it's on. And it is our belief that we need to have an arms embargo, that we need to work robustly for the path of justice and a solution. Thank you. Walsh for 1 minute and 30 seconds, please.
Over 6 months ago, the Irish government called for an urgent review of the EU-Israel Association Agreement. Time has since passed. Thousands of innocent Palestinians have been killed, and innocent hostages on the Israeli side not yet released. And yet the Commission and many member states in the European Union have failed to answer any calls. The EU is Israel's largest trading partner, with the agreement worth over 46 billion last year. And one of the essential components of the agreement is a respect for human rights. I'm not the first MEP to say that tonight, and I won't be the last. However, what is happening to Palestinians right now is a human rights violation of its highest order, and we can call it many different things. I have used the term genocide because that is what I believe it is. Following on from a letter sent to President Ursula von der Leyen with my colleagues, I once again urgently call for immediate review of the agreement. The EU's response, or dare I say lack of response, over these some 345 days is a defying moment for us all. What began as the world's most successful peace project cannot now turn its back on one of the most violent and lethal atrocities of the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for sticking to the speaking time. Next speaker is Mr. Nemec for 1 minute, please.
Spoštovani visoki zbor, smo na pragu še eno leto trajajoče vojne v Gazi.
The crisis in Gaza has lasted a year now, supported by Western weapons. More than 41,000 Palestinian citizens, including women and children, have been cruelly murdered. The refugee camps, schools, UN offices all have been destroyed. It is shameful to look how EU and the US sit back and do nothing. It's simply regret developments. Whilst women and children are on the front line of the fight against the Israeli government. Then MEPs have signed letters and
we cannot sit back and let this happen without saying anything. We need a ceasefire, and we need to prevent a further outbreak of violence. That is our moral duty. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Ms. Scuderi. 1 minute, please.
Thank you, President.
41,000 Palestinians have lost their lives, 16,000 children killed, 17,000 orphans. Can you hear the silence? This is the deafening silence of Europe that isn't acting, the silence of our complicity, the atrocities of the 7th of October that we condemned, and rightly so, cannot in any way justify war crimes and genocidal acts. There is no justification for what is occurring in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank and for what the Palestinian people have been suffering all this time. How much longer do we have to wait to condemn and sanction the Israeli government as we've done in other conflicts? How long should we wait to stop sending weapons and to suspend economic relations between Israel and the EU? How many lives are too many lives? How long should we wait until we recognize the Palestinian state? Europe should defend peace, human rights and justice. So let us put an end to the massacre, shall we? Let's put an end to the genocide.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Ms. Jedin. 1 minute.
Fru talman, över 41 000 döda, över 95 000 människor skadade.
Thank you very much. We've heard time and again the number of people who have lost their lives, the number of people who have been injured as a result of the policies of the extreme right government in Israel, which has been bombarding Gaza incessantly and destroying the infrastructure comprehensively. We all know what's happening, and I am very proud that my country, Sweden, has helped the refugees who've been injured as extensively as we have. But it's the self-same country which has actually refused to take in a lot of seriously injured people from Gaza, and that is actually a racist policy. And therefore, I would argue that it is a policy of the Swedish government that's based on Palestinians' lives being of a lesser value. We have got to achieve a ceasefire. We have got to do our utmost to bring this about, and we have got to review, reconsider, suspend the association agreement, and we've got to have visa bans and travel bans. It's high time that we did something more effective and that we had a policy which was worthy of a union which calls itself a union of peace.
For 1 minute, please.
Casi un año ya de los terribles atentados.
It's been 1 year since the terrible attacks and the genocidal invasion of Netanyahu. And since the last debate that took place in February, we've seen polio ravaging among young children who have got their first dose and are going to get their second dose by the end of the year. 560,000 girls and boys. I didn't give you the figure. And I think that this should be our main priority in today's debate. And then we need to equip hospitals to deal with hepatitis and diarrhea. I think that these should be the priorities today. And then other issues that we're not tackling. First of all, to overhaul the association agreement with Israel and, if necessary, suspend it. Secondly, sanctions, not only against settlers, but also against the Netanyahu government. And thirdly, we have to put an end to apartheid, because this is an invasion, an illegal occupation, and the only solution is the two-state solution.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Mr. Oliveira for 1 minute, please.
11 months, more than 41,000, the majority women and children. More than 1,700,000 people forced to flee their homes in Gaza, a region which has been completely destroyed. Israel is preventing the most basic access to food or health care, and the EU, which is always willing to tell others what to do, has let this genocide run its course.
while we sit back and discuss the matter, could we not even just suspend the trade agreement with Israel? Enough hypocrisy, enough complicity. Suspend the EU-Israel Association Agreement. Let's call for an immediate ceasefire. And let's adhere to the UN resolutions and return to the borders of 1967 and the right to return for refugees.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Mr. Tarquinio for 1 minute, please.
Grazie, signora Presidente, signor Commissario.
Thank you very much. Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, the massacre and the hostage-taking back in 2023 was a horrendous crime. Everyone this evening has reiterated this, but no crime justifies another crime. The members of the Netanyahu government show scorn vis-à-vis the lives of Palestinians. They're breaching and violating international law. They're causing provocations and changing the status of Jerusalem and the Holy Land is an example. We're really witnessing the destruction of houses, domicide, in order to deal a blow to the population. And we have to come up with incisive choices. We have to sanction those who are carrying out these crimes and ethnic cleansing. We have to ban the export of weapons. We need a ceasefire and we need the release of hostages. And above all, the time has come to recognize the Palestinian state side by side, the Israeli state. It's only this way that peace can begin.
And next speaker is Ms. Martins for 1 minute, please.
Israel is using European weapons to kill innocent people, kill children, journalists, and human rights activists. My own country, Portugal, has kept the flag flying on a lorry which is carrying arms to Israel in contravention of UN resolutions. Not even those Israeli leaders who have publicly declared their intentions have stopped us from supporting Israel. When the EU has been unable to censure Israel, and with this, the EU is losing credibility in the eyes of the world and its citizens. We continue to protest against genocide, and these voices have to be heard. History will judge those who collaborate with the genocide in Gaza today.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Mr. Benifei for 1 minute.
Da ottobre 2023.
Since October last year, 5 children a day at a minimum have been killed or injured, and I am talking about the West Bank, not about Gaza. These numbers tell their own story. Netanyahu is trampling underfoot the rights of the Palestinians. They're unable to live in peace. Israelis and Palestinians should be able to live in peace, but he is perpetrating this destruction in order to achieve his own ends. It is high time he moved on. It's time that we impose sanctions, we in the European Union, on him and on the ministers that are actually condoning the violence perpetrated by the Israeli government. Of course, we need an immediate ceasefire. Of course, we need the release of the hostages, and we need a two-state solution endorsed by the global international community. We need a statehood for Palestine, and we should be following Norway and Spain and Ireland's example, recognising Palestine as a basis for constructing a durable peace henceforth. Thank you.
Gonsalves for 1 minute, please.
Cara Presidente.
President, More than 41,000 deaths, almost 100,000 injured. Day after day, the number of victims in Gaza continues to rise. Whole families, small children, Palestinians are being treated as collateral damage. And we're not just talking about Gaza, we're talking about the West Bank, where hundreds of people have been imprisoned over the last few weeks. Today, we have talked about the West Bank, where the protests have been underway. Even our colleague Rima Hassan was participating in protests there. Our duty is now to put a stop to the genocide. Our duty is to comply with international law. And we're not alone. The UN Secretary General has called for an immediate ceasefire. He has said we have gone too far. Now is the time to stand with the Palestinians. Now is the time for action. No more excuses.
Thank you very much. And now we are coming to the Catch the Eye, and I will start giving the floor to Mr. Ruotolo, place 709. For 1 minute, please. You need
no microphone.
The microphone, please.
No. Ok, perdono, grazie, ripeto. In 60...
Let me repeat what I was saying. In 60 seconds, I will tell you that the time has come to take decisions. First of all, we have to make sure that Israel can live safely and securely, and to do so, we have to immediately recognize the Palestinian state, like Spain, Ireland, and Norway have already done. This is the only way that we can sideline Hamas terrorists, because we'll be giving hope and we'll be giving a prospect of a future to the Palestinian people. We have to hold this spiral of death and help the Israeli opposition that want Netanyahu to stand down, because he is responsible for crimes against humanity. He is a responsible extremist. The barbarous acts of the 7th of October are something we condemn, but they do not justify collective revenge, which mean that the Palestinian people are living through what Amnesty said was living in a country that was the most uninhabitable. The word peace, shalom, peace now.
And the next will be Mr. Nikolaou Alavanos, please.
Η γενοκτονία του Παλαιστινιακού λαού στη Γάζα.
The genocide of the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip is endless. More than 40,000 people have been killed by the army, the elderly, civilians, women, children, and there's hunger, thirst, and disease. The heinous acts of the Israeli government are continuing in the West Bank. It is very clear that the aim was to elbow out the Palestinians and to stop a Palestinian state in its tracks. And these are the heinous crimes that the EU is supporting in so many ways, economically, militarily, and so on. EU funds are still ending in the hands of Israeli companies that manufacture weapons. And yet the peoples of Europe, unlike their governments, support the Palestinian people. We're in favor of a ceasefire. We want to stop operations in Gaza Strip in the West Bank. And the people have to be independent, make sure that the borders go back to 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as the capital.
The speaker I will give the floor is Ms. Strada, seat 714.
Io voglio proteggere la popolazione israeliana.
I want to protect the Israeli population, as many people have said. In order to protect the Israeli people, we need to stop the government in its tracks. Netanyahu is massacring democracy in his own country, as well as massacring the Palestinians. He is setting Israel outside, completely out with the democratic consensus global level, it's not possible to allow him to continue with impunity to commit these war crimes. He's exposing his people to decades of hatred in the future, further attacks, further escalation, and therefore we need to protect the Israeli population as well as the Palestinian population. We need to stop the Netanyahu government in its tracks now.
Thank you very much. And the last speaker in this Catch the Eye round will be Mr. Brown, seat 689. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ms. President. To all of you, honourable members advocating here for the terrorist state of Israel, did you not hear the words of Israeli leaders, generals, rabbis, referring to Palestinians as non-humans, as animals? This is regular praxis there. So the terrorist state of Israel is very dangerous, not only for Palestinians, but for us, Europeans, normal, decent people. We should bring Mr. Netanyahu and his genocidal butchers to some Nuremberg 2.0. I hope we'll live to see it. Thank you very much.
Okay, and I will not give the floor to any more speakers on the Catch the Eye because those who have asked for it has already had the floor today. So therefore, we have now come to the Commission, and I will give the floor back to the Commissioner, Mr. Lenarčič, please.
Madam President, honourable members, thank you for this very useful exchange. I would like to avoid repeating what I already said in my introduction, but I would like to underline what are our immediate priorities. They are full and safe humanitarian access to all those who need humanitarian aid within Gaza, ceasefire, release of hostages, and preparations for the day after. And the European Commission and the High Representative have been active on all these issues. The European Commission is the leading humanitarian donor to Palestinians. We support the ongoing efforts by the United States, Egypt and Qatar to reach a long overdue deal on ceasefire and hostages. And we are preparing for the day after. And we are also calling on our Arab and other international partners to assume their share of the responsibilities on all these issues. And as I said already, the Palestinian Authority, despite its current difficult financial situation and its demanding work on reforms, is the only viable solution for the future of Gaza. We will do our best and support the Palestinian Authority on this path. And again, the European Union and its member states are the leading supporters, financially and politically, of the Palestinian Authority. It's also important to continue our diplomatic outreach towards de-escalation in the wider region, engaging with all our key partners there, and we are doing that. And finally, we also are trying to restart difficult discussions on a sustainable, just and comprehensive solution for Israel and Palestine. And as many of you said today, the only solution is the two-state solution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Commissioner, for this. And with these remarks, the debate is closed.